Slug It. Written by Charles Bran. Narrated by Larissa Thompson. Chapter 4. Ivy clung to the sides of the aging Riverside Police Station, a squat building at the south end of town. There were 2 parking spots at the front of the building for visitors, and because it was still mid-morning, both were open. I parked my van and stepped outside. The heavy steel door squeaked loudly as I entered the police station. In reaction to the sound, a desk sergeant walked into view behind a glass pane fitted into the wall. The only other features in the room were a gumball machine, 2 chairs, and a single door with a large security lock on it. The desk sergeant smiled at me. He was a big guy with a shaved head and biceps bulging under his shirt sleeves.
"Can I help you?" the bald man asked.
"Yes," I said. "I'm a reporter for the Riverside Sentinel." Technically, I was a reporter for the Greenville Gazette and the Chesterfield Courier, but both of those were papers owned by the Sentinel, so technically I was part of their staff. The Sentinel's name carried a bit more weight, especially in Riverside.
The bald man frowned. "The deputy chief isn't here right now," he said. "He handles the media."
I smiled. I knew Deputy Chief Burke, and I was glad for the chance to avoid him. The Riverside Metropolitan Police Department was in charge of law enforcement in all of our towns, not just Riverside, and Burke was a constant presence at town council meetings. He didn't seem to like reporters much, despite the fact that it was his job to deal with them. Everybody at the Sentinel tried to avoid him whenever possible. A lot of us went to the school resource officers whenever we could. They were always friendly and professional, and eager to get more attention to the youth drug use prevention programs. "That's all right," I said. "He probably can't comment anyway. I was just hoping someone could confirm for me that there's an ongoing investigation and that you can't tell me anything." The desk sergeant shrugged.
"I can tell you if there's a file," he said. "Can't tell you what's in it."
"Works for me," I said. The bald man nodded for me to go ahead as he took a seat in front of a computer monitor. "It's related to the fire yesterday," I said. "A young woman reported a missing person, Zev Jackson."
"All right," he said. "Can you spell that?"
I spelled Zev's name. And then I said, as if in afterthought, "I mean, if you can tell me that they found him and there's no case, I could just drop the story. Then I wouldn't have to bother the deputy chief about it." The desk sergeant didn't answer, his eyes focused on the screen. The monitor was positioned so that it faced away from the window. There was no chance of me seeing anything. I waited while the man worked the computer. That was when I heard a loud, squeaking sound and felt a gust of cold air as the door opened behind me.
"What the hell is this?" the entrant growled.
I glanced over my shoulder and froze. Deputy Chief Rudy Burke stood glaring at me in a starched blue uniform. The polished badge on his chest shined almost as brightly as the sweat on his forehead, dribbling its way past a throbbing vein that twitched in tandem with his beady blue eyes. His dark hair struggled to hide a shiny, bald pate underneath a bold and unsuccessful attempt at a comb-over. We stared at each other for a moment. I could see Burke's rage rising more and more with every moment that he looked at me. To be honest, he had good reason to hate me. It wasn't fair, but it made sense. It was about that story I'd written, the biggest story I'd ever had, about town clerk Antonia Burke embezzling money. Antonia Burke was the deputy chief's sister. Deputy Chief Burke had tried to get the Sentinel to publish his letter to the editor anonymously. He said it was an opinion he had as a private citizen, but not one that he could express as a public official. But the editors had refused. Rightly, I thought. If you wanted to say something in the public square, you had to be willing to stake your reputation on it. It would set a really bad precedent if we published something without a name. Val had shown me what Burke had written, to give me a heads up that he might have it out for me. Burke said that although what Antonia Burke did was wrong, the Riverside Sentinel and its reporter, Eliza Cartwright, had been unnecessarily cruel and vindictive in embarrassing Antonia publicly, presumably by reporting what she had done and what she had said about it.
"Well," Burke spat, "if it isn't Miss Cartwright."
He spoke my last name as if it was a vile curse word.
What are you doing here?
Great, I thought. He recognized me on sight. I'm working on a story, I said. I met his stare. The vein in his forehead twitched. Gross. Burke clenched his fists. He turned to the window behind me.
What are you doing?
He demanded of the desk sergeant.
You should be working, not making eyes at the local riffraff. Don't forget, you're on the taxpayer's dime.
Jeez, I'd hate to work for this guy. Yelling at somebody seemed to have helped Burke take control of his temper. He straightened his tie and turned back to me.
You should know not to bother my officers,
Burke said. He stared back at me, his blue eyes suddenly sharp and cold.
You're supposed to talk to me.
I know, I said. It unnerved me the way Burke had abruptly flipped from boiling rage to steely, seething hostility. Hot anger was something I could understand. It didn't scare me. But to see someone turn it off in an instant, to flip their hot anger down to burn cold, it made the man seem inhuman, like a psychopath. It was alarming, but I was a reporter. I didn't let hostility stop me from asking questions. When I first walked into the police station, I knew that I might be dealing with Burke, and I'd come in here anyway. I could do this. I had to. Because if the police weren't looking for Zev, well, I didn't know what I'd do about that. I just had to make sure they were looking for him. I held my ground, taking a breath and steadying myself. I came in here looking for you, I said. You weren't picking up your phone.
Then you should have left a message,
Burke said. He folded his arms over his chest and took a step toward me. I didn't move. I looked away from the intensity of his glaring eyes, just for a second, but then I turned to stare back at him. I'm on a deadline, I said.
Not my problem,
Burke said. Look, I just want you to confirm that there's an ongoing investigation. A vein in Burke's forehead twitched.
If there is an investigation, I can't give you any details,
he said. I know, I said, but we have to ask before we publish.
Yeah, now you're all professional.
I clenched my fists, but refused to allow myself to be distracted. There's a student who might be missing, I said. Burke frowned at me, his beady eyes squinting. After a moment, he said,
The department doesn't have any open missing person cases. Now beat it.
He turned toward the interior door and started pulling out a keycard. I know there was a student who reported Zev Jackson missing. Did you find him? Burke turned back to me and started cracking his knuckles.
There are no open missing persons cases, he repeated.
The man turned to face me. The vein in his forehead throbbed as his voice became heated again.
Now listen here, Burke growled. If you decide to take some co-ed's words and start making something out of nothing just so you can make yourself famous, I'll make you regret it.
I stared at him in disbelief. So Burke knew about what Mel had reported, and he was just dismissing it?
I got a new friend, Burke went on, a libel lawyer, and you don't want me to call him.
With a final sneer, Burke opened the interior door, walked through, and then slammed it behind him. I was still feeling a little shaken by my encounter with Burke 4 hours later. I wasn't worried about Burke's legal threat, not just because I knew I hadn't done anything wrong. I wasn't even really working on a story, but also because I was sure he wouldn't follow through. A police officer suing a reporter, and one that had previously reported on the misconduct of his sister, it wouldn't go well for him. That threat was empty. No, what was worrying was that Burke had implied that the police department had completely dismissed what Mel had told them. And that was why I was now sitting on a couch in the English Literature building at ASU. ASU, that was the vulgar but entertaining nickname for Allen Scadding University. University officials could say ASU as often as they wanted, but the people had spoken. The campus was ASU by popular acclaim. The building was bright, white walls and white tile floors and huge 15-foot windows that bathed the nook I was sitting in with sunlight. I was seated with my back to the windows and my eyes on the door that led into a nearby classroom. I had my work computer on my lap, but that was just to make me look like I wasn't loitering as I stared at the doors into the lecture hall, watching the students filter in. If I saw Zev, he'd probably figure out what I was up to and call me a stalker, and he had a bit of a point. It was a little creepy how I had pieced together that he was in this class. Zev had often complained about the literature classes he was forced to take for his journalism degree, and his hatred was especially strong for one professor in particular. Zev had taken to texting me particularly ludicrous quotations from lectures every now and then, stuff like, "This post-dialectic approach can be used not for deconstruction, but neo-deconstruction." Although the class was allegedly about the modern novel, I gathered that more than half of the assigned reading was dense, barely comprehensible literary criticism. The timestamps on Zev's text messages had allowed me to cross-reference with the course listings and to pinpoint which English class Zev was in, so that I could sit outside and catch him. I was going to be really embarrassed if Zev realized how much work I'd put into figuring out where he would be, but it was still going to be a load off my mind to see him. I was already thinking about what I'd say to him when he showed up. "I was worried about you, you ass. I just wanted to make sure you didn't die in a fire. Don't be a dick about it." When he did show up, I'd probably get flustered and my whole planned speech would go out the window, but at least I'd know he was okay. Besides, I'd already tried everything else I could think of. Zev's Twitter was silent. I figured he had to have some friends on campus, but I had no way of figuring out who they were. Come to think of it, I'd never heard him talk about any friends. I couldn't remember a single conversation where he referenced something other than school, work, or video games. And he had only ever talked about playing with strangers, the sort whose communications consisted mostly of yelling the most vile insults they could think of at one another. I was starting to feel like a bad friend. I'd only known the guy for a couple years, but I realized that I didn't even know when Zev's birthday was. He had bought me a coffee on mine. I'd have to make it up to him. I didn't know how I'd do that, but, well, maybe I wouldn't snap at him for making fun of me once he showed up to class, saw me lurking outside, and realized how worried about him I'd been. I sighed and tapped my foot impatiently as I stared at the classroom door. It had been a couple minutes since the last student had gone in. I knew Zev couldn't skip the class again. He'd also been complaining to me about the brutal attendance policy. Since he'd already missed 2 classes when he got the flu, he couldn't miss one more class or he'd be docked 10% off his final grade for each additional absence. I glanced up at the clock on the wall. 12:35 p.m. Zev was already 5 minutes late. Surely, no matter how late he'd been up or how hungover he was, he'd managed to stagger over here. Zev was a troublemaker, but he took his grades seriously. He didn't seem to have any respect for college as an institution, but he had a competitive streak a mile wide and hated to lose at anything. I sat there, staring at the door. I started cracking my knuckles, one by one. If Zev missed this class, it didn't mean that he was definitely missing. Well, it sure would be worrying, but maybe he figured he could get the professor to accept my dorm burned down as a reasonable excuse for another absence. Maybe he was just going to take the hit to his grade, or retake the class. ASU let you erase a bad grade from your transcript if you took a course over again, and it was possible that someone else was going to teach Hemingway next semester. Or maybe Zev was feeling down after losing his possessions in the fire. Maybe he was thinking, screw everything, I'm not going to that awful class today. I felt my pulse race as the minutes ticked by. I stared at my watch and watched the second hand move lazily, like it was swimming through thick, sticky mud on its circular journey. 12:43 p.m. Still no sign of Zev. Had I missed him? I got up, carrying my laptop under my arm. The classroom door was hanging open. I walked over to it and peered in. At the front of the class slouched a man with a flannel shirt worn with an actual honest-to-God bow tie. I did a quick pan of the room. A couple of the students glanced at me, but Zev was not there. I slipped away before the professor saw me, walking quickly back to the couch. I sat back down and sighed. Zev was probably just skipping, or he had decided to bomb the class and retake it. Probably. That was when I realized that there was something else I could check. I felt like an idiot for not thinking of it sooner, especially considering all the effort I had put into figuring out when and where Zev's Hemingway class was. Zev and I both had 2 email accounts, one for each of the weekly papers we reported for, and all 4 accounts shared the same password. We used each other's accounts when someone was on vacation, because a lot of our stories came from things people emailed into us. In theory, Val could check up on our correspondence and make sure we were on top of everything. But Val usually didn't bother. She left our email for us to manage. So if Zev had messages that were marked as read or archived from this morning, it was probably him who had done it. I logged in, and my heart sank when I saw the rows of brightly highlighted, unread messages. I scrolled down to try to find the timestamp of the last message that had been read. And then I froze. Zev had received an email from Deputy Chief Burke yesterday afternoon, a few hours before the fire. Mr. Jackson, in response to your voicemail, there is no woman named Angela Miller listed as a legal resident of Dover or any other town in the Riverside metropolitan area. There is no record or evidence of any crimes associated with a woman named Angela Miller. Reporting anything to the contrary would be an irresponsible fabrication or unsubstantiated rumor-mongering. If there was a homicide investigation, news of this would be promptly reported to larger and more important news organizations. We take our responsibility to keep the public informed seriously. I do not appreciate your implication that the police are not doing our job. Actual arrests and incidents can be found in the police blotter, as true professionals should be well aware. The email ended there, with no signature. I was stunned. I stared blankly at my laptop screen for a moment, and then read the email again. On the second reading, with each line of the email I read, I felt my shoulders tightening with tension and dread. I was starting to think that Zev might really be in danger, at least if he wasn't already dead. I didn't know what had happened, but it was the word homicide that scared me. I didn't know what Zev had said to Burke, but it was clear that Zev seemed to think the police were failing to investigate a murder. It wasn't clear to me whether this Angela Miller was the person Zev thought was a murderer, or whether he thought she was a murder victim. Either way, Zev was pursuing something hot, something dangerous. And someone who may have been wearing a ski mask had been in his dorm room. Mel had seen that. She wasn't sure how big the person was or what they looked like, but she was sure that the person had been hiding their face. Damn it. Zev had been so jealous when I had landed the corruption story. He had wanted a big break himself. That hunger may have driven him to take some stupid risks. And I knew how things went. There was no reason to assume that Burke was the only person Zev had called. A lot of the reporter game is calling people and waiting for them to call you back. A good percentage of people never respond, so you call a lot of people and hope that at least 1 or 2 will get back to you. It wasn't a sneaky way of finding information. Word could easily get around that you wanted to talk to someone. If Zev was looking into a murder, there was no reason to think he had done it with any degree of discretion. Zev didn't dance around anyone's nerves. He acted like he was bulletproof. And then his dorm had burned down. Not only that, but Mel had said that she saw smoke billowing out of the open door to his room when she saw the guy carrying him. And Mel had specifically said that she saw the guy carrying Zev into the woods. What if Zev really had been back there calling for help? Maybe no one else had heard because they had all been standing too close to the sirens. That memory I had, it was real. And so was the pain in the back of my head. I could still feel the sore spot. I knew that I hadn't been drinking. I would never have done that. There was no way. I couldn't believe that I had talked myself into believing that I could have done that, even for a moment. I hadn't been unconscious because of alcohol. I had been unconscious because someone hit me in the back of the head. And it was the head injury that made my memories all jumbled and fuzzy. An authority figure in a uniform had told me that I'd been drinking, and like a sap, I had believed him, going against my intuition and against the knowledge I had about the sort of person I was. I had talked myself into dismissing my fears. I had told myself that the man Mel had seen must have been a friend saving Zev's life, that Zev had to be okay because the police hadn't reported him missing yet. But Burke wasn't even looking for him. And this email, it changed everything. It meant that there was someone out there who had a good reason to hurt Zev, a motive. If Zev was right, if there was some sort of homicide that the Riverside police didn't know about, the murderer would want to stop Zev. And if they had already killed someone once before, I had to do something. I had to call the police or... Damn it! I already had talked to the police. So had Mel. Burke had dismissed both of us. And showing him this email wouldn't change anything. He knew about it already. That bald prick wasn't going to lift a finger to search for Zev. All because of some stupid grudge against me and the Riverside Sentinel. This was bad. I glanced back at the message, still open in front of me. And then I realized that the same password that had opened Zev's email would also open his laptop. The laptop that I had seen sitting on his desk this morning. I needed to know more. I needed to know if I was letting my concern for my friend cause me to start jumping to wild conclusions. And I needed to know what the hell had happened to me last night, too. I hated the fact that there were gaps in my memory, and that the memories I did have didn't make sense to me. I couldn't just slide past that. And underneath it all was a lingering fear. What if I really had gotten drunk last night? I wanted to believe that the paramedic was full of shit, but I was also suspicious of myself, of how strongly motivated I was to want to dismiss the possibility. I realized that there was one more detail that didn't add up. The man Mel had seen had been carrying Zev out of the burning building. If it was someone who wanted to hurt Zev, they could have left him there to burn. But the fire had started in Zev's room, and Mel had heard an argument. Was the man in the black mask the murderer, who was worried that Zev was going to expose his crime? But if he was, why save Zev? Well, maybe Zev knew something, and the man in the black mask needed to know what Zev knew, or who he had told. Unwelcome, the image came to me of Zev tied to a chair with a dark figure holding a knife to his throat, demanding his cooperation. Was that an actual possibility? That Zev wasn't dead, yet, but soon would be if someone didn't do something? I slammed my laptop shut, shoved it into my bag, and dashed out the door. Chapter 5. The sun was probably shining outside, but in the office of the Riverside Weeklies, the only illumination came from the dim fluorescent box in the ceiling. Val had her headphones in and was chuckling at whatever she was listening to. Her laptop screen was facing away from me, but I knew she would be able to see me with her peripheral vision. As casually as I could, I reached out, grabbed Zev's laptop off of his desk, and placed it in front of me. I glanced back at Val. She was adjusting the way her gray ponytail stuck out of the back of her baseball hat, but her eyes were fixed on her screen. If I was lucky, she was catching up on sports. Probably waiting to hear back from a paginator or something. When Val was working, she was apt to get distracted and make some idle chit-chat, or ask me what I was working on. But if she was watching a game, she would be completely engrossed. Either way, she didn't seem to notice what I'd done. I powered up the computer and logged in. Zev's desktop was, unsurprisingly, cluttered. Half a dozen documents with various file names were arranged haphazardly. At the top right was a folder labeled Old. I clicked on it and found it filled to the brim with what looked like every story Zev had ever written. I navigated back to the desktop and started looking through the files. There was a story about a town council meeting, another about a library event, and a third that was an interview with a man who ran a tree farm talking about the difficulties of dealing with beavers on your property. It looked like Zev was waiting on a callback from a park ranger to finish the story. I looked at the other documents. They were just a bunch of story ideas, some with phone numbers and people he might call, others empty except for the file name. I wasn't getting anywhere on the desktop. I began to search the files on the computer for the name Angela Miller. But when all I had written in the search bar was ANGE, a file appeared. A document titled, simply, Angela. The search results showed that the file had been hidden inside one of the system folders. I double-clicked on the document and started reading. Esteemed editor, I know you hate gonzo style, but just read this and try to tell me it's not better this way. Love and kisses, Z. Flames leapt into the air, and I jumped back from the sudden burst of light and heat. The burst of fire split in two, twirling into two flaming ribbons that spun around the woman in front of me, and casting dancing lights on her pale skin and purple lingerie. Impressive, I said. The performer, a self-styled erotic magician named Raven Prudence, gave this reporter a smile at the compliment. I should hope so, she said, deservedly without modesty. After some chit-chat, Prudence asked me to guess at how the trick was done. It's flash paper, right? I said. Prudence shook her head. Here, look closely at my hand, the magician said. Where would I keep something like that? Prudence encouraged me to examine her hand, and I did so. I didn't see a rubber thumb or anything that was palmed. A split second after I nodded and let go, she made a burst of fire appear in that same hand I had just examined. This reporter leapt back and laughed in delight. Where are you hiding your props? I asked, noting with absolute professional detachment that the purple bra and panties Prudence wore did not leave any obvious places for the magician to conceal anything. Prudence said that this is the central conceit of her act. I think erotic dancing and magic go very well together, she said, for the simple reason that everyone expects you not to be able to do these tricks without something up your sleeves. Prudence added that the performance is also compelling for other reasons. The beauty of the human body is nothing to be ashamed of, and it provides built-in misdirection. Is it flash paper? I asked. Prudence simply smiled. It's magic, she said. I could do it again naked if you like. That might be a bit unprofessional, this reporter said, regrettably, a paragon of journalistic integrity. Prudence said she plans to use her act to get more attention for her real passion in life, psychic personal coaching. As a member of the local Wiccan community, Prudence claims to be a sensitive. She also claims that she can help people unlock their hidden potential. Although her description of the benefits of coaching includes some that sound relatively conventional, like increased confidence, Prudence claims to be able to go even farther. Every person has psi potential, she said. As impressed as I was by her act, I found myself more skeptical of these claims, a fact that Prudence didn't fail to miss when I asked her how exactly one spells the word psi. Most people will never accept the world of psi phenomena, Prudence said, but for those who do believe, it can seem quite confusing, even frightening. Prudence said that this is why she is seeking media attention, and will continue to do so with her fire-dancing illusions. People need to know that there is someone out there they can get in touch with, she said. Someone who will believe the unbelievable. Although most Riversiders will be as skeptical as I am of Prudence's claims, her magic act is guaranteed to impress. She is currently seeking performance venues for 2 shows she has prepared, one for adults 18 or older only, and another act that, if not family-friendly, perhaps is best described as PG-13. This reporter, for one, will be keeping a very close eye on Prudence's career, so that the dispatch can keep all our insatiable readers abreast of her bountiful talents. Her eye-catching illusions are sure to bring complete satisfaction to her rapidly swelling audience. For more information about Prudence, visit prudentmagic.com. Despite everything, I had to stop myself from laughing several times as I read through the story. When I hit the last paragraph, I really did bark out a laugh, and then I spun around to glance back at Val. She was gone. I couldn't believe I hadn't noticed her leaving. I had been too engrossed in what I had been reading. Tension pressed down onto my shoulders, tightening the muscles in my back. I felt like I had spent all day like a compressed spring, straining to keep its shape underneath a heavy weight. Had Val seen what I was doing over my shoulder? No, Val was blunt. She would have said something if she had seen that I was poking around on Zev's laptop. I bit my lip and turned back to the laptop screen. Raven Prudence sounded like a pseudonym, an obvious one, and this document had been labeled Angela, with no last name. Was Raven Prudence actually Angela Miller? It seemed likely. I wished I could hear the voicemail that Burke had been responding to. Was Zev suspicious that Angela Miller had killed someone? Or did he think someone had killed her? I imagined the woman Zev had described in his story as a killer. Well, she was definitely off her rocker, talking about all that psi stuff. Maybe she had a psychotic break with reality. Or maybe someone had discovered the secret behind her magic tricks and threatened to reveal it. This woman was clearly trying to make money with a reputation as a sensitive, whatever that was. She had said outright that her magic act was mostly just to get more attention for her psychic personal coaching thing. Every psychic had to know that what they did was bull. Cold reading isn't something you can do by accident. Pretending that you have a supernatural ability to glean information requires a lot of conscious practice. I had heard that a lot of mentalists preyed on people who were grieving and desperate for communication with someone who had passed away. That was where the money was. If Angela Miller was that sort of grifter, then she would have to be someone brimming with cynicism and cold calculation. Could she be a killer? But then how had Zev found out about it? And if there was a dead body for Zev to point to, would Burke really be able to dismiss him so easily? On the other hand, Angela Miller / Raven Prudence might have been the murder victim. She was clearly a very attractive woman, one who was not afraid to use her sexuality to get more attention for her performances. Women like that could acquire fans and stalkers. But Burke had claimed that there was no record of anyone named Angela Miller living in Dover or anywhere else in the Riverside region. That covered a pretty large geographical area, even if the population was relatively modest. Up in this part of the state, there was pretty much Riverside, the surrounding towns that the Riverside PD covered, the college, and then a good half hour of state forests and campgrounds until you made it back to civilization. Okay, how about a different scenario? Zev had been in contact with Angela Miller. Then, all of a sudden, she disappears, stops returning his calls and emails. It doesn't make any sense. Angela Miller clearly wanted as much publicity as possible. Zev starts to worry that something happened to her. He contacts the police, and then Burke brushes him off. And then I didn't know. I needed more information, more pieces of the puzzle. I entered the website from the article. A black page with purple text appeared. Page under construction. I frowned. And then I realized that Zev might have other files hidden with the story I had just read. I went back to the laptop search results, selected the file named Angela, and clicked Open File Location. My eyes widened. There were 2 other documents in that folder. One was named Untitled Document. The other was called Prostitution. But before I had a chance to open either of them, there was a knock at the door. I slammed the laptop shut. One of the daily reporters opened the door, a tall redhead. I thought her name was Jessie Maxwell, Or maybe it was Jamie Wainwright. I saw the Daily Reporter's names in print all the time, but they rarely ventured into the windowless cave of the weeklies. "Lockwood wants to see you," the redhead said. "What?" I asked. The only Lockwood I knew worked in the advertising department. "Up on the second floor?" "Yeah, you're supposed to see him right away." "Why would I do that?" I said. At the Sentinel, advertising was kept strictly separate from news. Val had told me that if someone working in advertising ever tried to give me a lead for a story, I should feel free to tell them to pound sand. "You probably should, if you want to keep out of trouble," she said. "Lockwood's the new head editor." Wait, what the hell had she just said? "Lockwood?" I burst out. The woman in front of me just sighed. "That's bull," I said. "There's no way." I knew that the Sentinel was looking for a new head editor because the old guy was retiring. But Lockwood? That couldn't be true. It was asinine. "Afraid so," she said in a resigned voice. At first, I couldn't believe it. But then I saw the cynical calculation that must have been behind the decision. Not too long ago, Lockwood had convinced the publisher, the man who owned the newspaper, to run native advertisements on the back pages of the papers. Despite claims to the contrary, those stories were nothing but ads dressed up as news, with a tiny line at the bottom explaining that what you'd just read was a dirty trick. Everybody in editorial was furious, but I guess it was helping the paper make more money. That was one thing, but making Lockwood head editor? That meant that the publisher had more or less put him in charge of everything. It wasn't like I didn't understand how our bread gets buttered. A newspaper needs a good sales team or the wheels fall off the wagon. But that team was supposed to stay far, far away from the driver's seat. The head editor was supposed to make sure the paper was fulfilling its true mission, to tell the truth. Putting Lockwood in charge was a definitive statement that the paper was going to start putting money-making over truth-telling. It meant that the Sentinel was already dead. This was too much to deal with. I was already homeless, I was worried about Zev, and now the one thing in my life that was still good was being ruined too? I wanted to just go out to my van, lie down on the mattress, pull the blanket over myself, and hide from it all. But that wasn't going to solve anything. And I sure wasn't going to let my emotions show in front of one of my coworkers. So I took a deep breath. "How can they do that?" I said. "It's horrible." "Look, just go," the girl said. "He already fired Jesse. You don't want to be next, do you?" "What? What did Jesse do?" "Well, Jesse was really mad about, and then Lockwood didn't want to run this story about a recovering drug addict. Lockwood said it was off-brand." You could hear the Daily Reporter's dislike of Lockwood in the way she said those last two words. "Ugh," I said, indicating my agreement with her disdain. "So Jesse went down to the paginators, logged in at the last second, and changed it so that his story was on the front page right before it got sent to the printer," the woman continued. "I think it was his way of quitting." I sighed. "I guess that's a good way to go." "You'd better get to Lockwood's office," the redhead said. "Unless you're quitting too. Couldn't blame you. But, some of us have bills to pay." The woman seemed like she was feeling a little awkward about the fact that she hadn't taken the same stand as the guy who had been fired. "Yeah," I said. "I know how it is, and I guess I have to go up there." "Good luck," the redhead said with a sad, sympathetic smile. "All right," I said, rising and cracking my knuckles. "Thanks." This has been Slug It, written by Charles Bran. Narrated by Larissa Thompson. Copyright 2020 by Charles B. Kreutzkamp. Production copyright 2021 by Charles B. Kreutzkamp.